The sledgehammer felt heavy in my hands as I stared at the hole we'd just punched through the basement wall. Dust particles floated through the beam of Marcus's flashlight, and there, recessed into a cavity that shouldn't exist according to any blueprint, sat a floor safe the size of a small refrigerator. Its surface was covered in rust and grime, but the combination lock gleamed as if it had been oiled recently. Very recently. Marcus whistled low and long beside me, his weathered face registering the same confusion I felt. The house had been empty for 5 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody should have been down here touching anything, let alone maintaining a hidden safe that the real estate disclosure had never mentioned. What we found inside that safe 3 hours later didn't just explain why Thomas Brennan had vanished without warning in the spring of 2019. It revealed a truth so disturbing that I understood completely why he'd walked away from everything he owned, everyone he knew, and never looked back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started, 6 weeks before we discovered that wall cavity, back when I thought the biggest challenge in my life would be choosing between subway tile or hexagon tile for the bathroom renovation. The real estate listing for 1847 Maple Ridge Drive had been sitting on the market for 8 months when I first saw it. Ashford Grove wasn't exactly a hot destination for young professionals fleeing the chaos of Portland, but the coastal town had a certain weathered charm that appealed to people looking for quieter lives. The Victorian house stood at the end of a tree-lined street where the pavement crumbled into gravel, backing up against a stretch of woods that eventually gave way to the rocky Oregon coastline. The photographs on the listing showed peeling paint, overgrown gardens, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in what looked like decades. The asking price had dropped twice since the initial posting, and even then, Victor Kane admitted during our first phone call that he was struggling to generate any interest whatsoever. There's nothing wrong with the structure, he'd assured me with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who'd given this speech many times before. The foundation is solid, the roof was replaced in 2015, and the electrical system was updated in 2017. It just needs someone with vision who isn't afraid of a little work. A little work turned out to be a spectacular understatement, but I'd known that going in. My divorce from Kevin had been finalized 4 months earlier, and the settlement had left me with enough money to either make a down payment on a sterile condo in the city or take a risk on something with actual character. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had character in abundance, even if most of that character currently manifested as water damage, outdated fixtures, and carpeting that probably violated several health codes. Victor met me at the property on a gray Tuesday morning in early March, his silver sedan looking absurdly pristine parked in front of the decrepit Victorian. He was a tall man in his late 50s with the kind of perpetual tan that suggested either a dedicated skincare routine or regular golf outings. His handshake was firm and dry, his smile revealing teeth that were almost unnaturally white. As we walked up the cracked pathway toward the front porch, I noticed him glancing at the neighboring houses with an expression that might have been nervousness or simply professional assessment of the property's context. The previous owner left rather suddenly, Victor explained as he fumbled with the lockbox hanging from the front doorknob. Thomas Brennan. Nice enough fellow from what I understand, though I never met him personally. He purchased the property in 2014, did some renovations, and then in April of 2019, he just stopped coming around. The house has been in a sort of legal limbo since then, estate issues and whatnot. His wife Diane disappeared around the same time, which complicated matters considerably. I paused with my hand on the porch railing, processing this information. They both vanished? Together? Victor's smile tightened slightly as he finally got the lockbox open and extracted a tarnished brass key. The police investigated, naturally. No evidence of foul play, no financial troubles that anyone could identify, no signs of marital discord. They simply left one day and never returned. The family eventually had them declared legally dead after the standard waiting period, and the estate finally got released for sale about a year ago. These situations happen more often than you'd think, though usually there's some explanation that surfaces eventually. The interior of the house smelled like abandonment, that particular combination of mildew, dust, and stagnant air that accumulates in spaces left untouched for years. The entry hall featured dark wood paneling that might have been beautiful once but now looked oppressive and dated. A staircase with an ornate banister curved upward into shadows, and doorways opened into rooms that Victor navigated with the confidence of someone who'd shown this property many times without ever generating a serious offer. The living room had furniture still arranged as if someone might return any moment. A coffee table held a stack of magazines with dates from early 2019, their pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The kitchen featured appliances from the 1990s and linoleum flooring that had once been white but had aged into an unpleasant grayish beige. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms and a bathroom showcased floral wallpaper and carpeting that predated the Brennans by at least 2 decades. Everything about the house felt frozen in time, waiting for occupants who would never come back. The basement access was through a door in the kitchen that Victor opened with visible reluctance. The stairs descended into darkness that his flashlight barely penetrated, revealing a space that was surprisingly large but completely unfinished. Concrete floors, exposed beams, stone foundation walls that wept moisture during Oregon's endless rainy season. "This is where you'd want to focus if you're thinking about adding value," Victor said without much conviction. "Finish the basement properly and you could add substantial square footage. The bones are good, just need someone willing to put in the effort and investment." I stood at the top of those stairs looking down into that dark space and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, but a kind of awareness that this house held secrets it hadn't chosen to reveal yet. The sensation passed quickly, replaced by my practical assessment of support beams, moisture issues, and the cost of proper basement finishing. I made an offer that afternoon, $20,000 below the already reduced asking price. Victor accepted within 3 hours, which should have told me something about how desperate the estate was to unload this property. The paperwork moved forward with surprising speed, and 6 weeks later I stood on that same crumbling front porch with a set of keys that were actually mine, staring at a house that represented either the best decision I'd ever made or a catastrophic mistake I'd be paying for over the next 30 years. My sister Natalie had driven up from Eugene to help with the initial cleaning, and she stood beside me with her arms crossed, evaluating the Victorian with the skeptical eye of someone who thought I'd lost my mind. "You could have bought something move-in ready," she observed for probably the 15th time since I'd told her about the purchase. "Something without a creepy backstory about vanishing owners and years of neglect. This is going to consume all your time and money." She wasn't wrong, but there was something about the house that had grabbed hold of me during that first viewing and refused to let go. Maybe it was the challenge of restoration, or maybe it was the need to prove to myself that I could build something meaningful after my marriage had crumbled into legal documents and divided assets. The house on Maple Ridge Drive became my project, my obsession, and eventually my path toward understanding truths I'd never anticipated discovering. The first month focused on surface-level improvements that made the house livable while I planned the larger renovation projects. I stripped wallpaper, tore up carpeting, and scrubbed decades of grime from hardwood floors that turned out to be gorgeous once you could actually see them. Natalie came up most weekends to help, and Claire Donovan, my best friend from college who'd coincidentally moved to Ashford Grove 3 years earlier, became a regular presence as well. Claire worked remotely as a graphic designer and had flexible hours that allowed her to show up with coffee and moral support whenever I sent desperate text messages about discovered water damage or suspicious electrical wiring. The neighbors on Maple Ridge Drive kept their distance initially, watching my comings and goings with the wariness that small towns often display toward newcomers. The house to my left stood empty, a foreclosure that had been sitting on the market even longer than mine. To my right lived Helen Garrett, a woman in her late 70s who I'd seen occasionally tending a garden that was immaculately maintained despite her obvious physical limitations. She'd wave politely when our paths crossed but never initiated conversation until one afternoon in mid-April when I was hauling contractor bags full of old insulation to the curb. Helen appeared at the property line with a mason jar of iced tea and an expression that suggested she'd been working up courage for this interaction. "You're doing a brave thing, taking on Thomas's house," she said without preamble, handing me the jar. "Most folks around here thought it would just sit empty until it fell down. There were rumors, you know, after they disappeared. People saying the house was cursed or that something terrible had happened inside. None of it true, of course, just small-town nonsense. But it kept buyers away." I accepted the tea gratefully and found myself studying Helen's face for signs of the knowledge she clearly possessed about my property's history. "Did you know them well? The Brennans?" Helen's expression shifted into something complicated, a mixture of fondness and concern that deepened the lines around her eyes. Thomas was a quiet man, kept to himself mostly. He'd wave hello and sometimes we'd chat about gardening, but he wasn't the social type. Diane was friendlier, always had a smile and a kind word. They seemed happy enough, no obvious problems that anyone could see. That's what made their disappearance so strange. No warning signs, no goodbye to neighbors, no forwarding address. Just gone one day like they'd never existed. The police came around asking questions for weeks, but nobody had anything useful to tell them. It was as if they'd been planning it for a long time and executed their exit perfectly. Over the following weeks, Helen became my primary source of information about the house's recent history. She'd lived on Maple Ridge Drive for 43 years and had watched several families come and go from 1847 before the Brennans purchased it. According to Helen, Thomas had been in his early 40s when he bought the property, some kind of consultant who worked from home and traveled occasionally for business that he never discussed in detail. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Diane had been younger, maybe mid-30s, with a quiet grace that Helen admired but never quite connected with despite their proximity. They'd done renovation work too, Helen told me during one of our porch conversations. Thomas was very focused on the basement particularly. Had contractors down there for weeks, doing work that seemed excessive for just finishing a lower level. Heavy equipment, specialized materials, lots of trips to hardware stores for supplies that Helen couldn't identify. When she'd asked casually what they were building, Thomas had been vague, mentioning something about a workshop and storage space. The work had been completed in late 2018, just a few months before the Brennans vanished. I hired Marcus Reed in early May to help with the major renovation projects I couldn't handle alone. Marcus ran a small contracting business in Ashford Grove and had a reputation for quality work at reasonable prices. He was a man in his mid-50s with calloused hands, a gray beard, and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible home renovation disaster and learned not to be surprised by anything. His initial assessment of the house was thorough and honest. "You've got good bones here," he told me after spending 2 hours examining the structure from attic to basement. The previous owner did some solid work on the electrical and plumbing. Whoever he hired knew what they were doing. The basement though, that's interesting. He did a lot of work down there that doesn't quite make sense from a typical renovation perspective. Some of these walls aren't load-bearing and they're not configured for living space. It's almost like he was building something specific, but I can't figure out what. Marcus and I developed a renovation plan that would unfold in stages over the course of several months. We'd tackle the kitchen first, then move to the bathrooms, and save the basement for last since it required the most extensive work. The budget was tight but manageable if we did some of the labor ourselves and didn't encounter any major surprises lurking behind walls or under floorboards. Claire joked that I was living in a construction zone, which was accurate but didn't bother me as much as it probably should have. There was something satisfying about the process of transformation, watching the house slowly reveal its potential through hard work and attention. The kitchen renovation progressed smoothly through May and into June. We gutted the space completely, removing those ancient appliances and hideous linoleum to expose the original hardwood underneath. New cabinets went in, along with butcher block countertops that Claire helped me sand and seal over the course of 3 very long weekends. The difference was dramatic, transforming the most depressing room in the house into something bright and functional that actually made me excited about cooking again. It was during the bathroom renovation in July that we first encountered something odd. Marcus was removing the vanity in the upstairs bathroom when he discovered a small gap behind the wall where the plumbing ran down to the first floor. Tucked into that gap was a manila envelope, water-stained but still intact, containing photographs that clearly belonged to the Brennans. The images showed Thomas and Diane at various locations around Ashford Grove, smiling at the camera with the forced happiness of people performing contentment rather than genuinely experiencing it. But it was the final photograph in the stack that made both Marcus and me pause. The image showed the basement of this house, but not as I'd seen it. In the photograph, one wall featured what looked like a large metal door set into reinforced framing, industrial and substantial in a way that seemed completely out of place in a residential basement. Why would someone hide photographs of their own basement? Marcus wondered aloud, and more importantly, where is that door now? The wall in the current basement showed no evidence of any such installation. I took the envelope to the Ashford Public Library the next morning, hoping Lily Chen might be able to help me understand what I discovered. Lily was the head librarian and the closest thing Ashford Grove had to a town historian, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked black hair and an encyclopedic knowledge of local records and gossip. She examined the photographs with interest that quickly shifted to concern when she reached the image of the basement. "This is very strange," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. Thomas Brennan didn't leave much of a paper trail in town. No local employment records, no involvement in community organizations, barely any interaction with local businesses beyond basic purchases. It was as if he was trying to live here without actually participating in the community. The photograph of that door, though, that suggests he was building something significant. Have you checked with the county to see if he pulled any permits for basement construction? The county records office occupied a dreary building on the outskirts of Ashford Grove, staffed by bureaucrats who seemed personally offended by requests for information. It took 3 visits and a carefully worded Freedom of Information Act request before I finally obtained copies of the permits Thomas Brennan had filed for work on 1847 Maple Ridge Drive. The documents revealed extensive basement renovation approved in September 2018, including structural reinforcement, electrical upgrades, and installation of what was vaguely described as secure storage infrastructure. The contractor listed on the permits was a company called Cascade Security Solutions, based out of Seattle. When I tried to look them up, I found that the business had been dissolved in late 2019, just months after the Brennans disappeared. The phone number on the permit applications was disconnected, the business address led to a virtual office space that had no record of the company, and online searches turned up absolutely nothing about Cascade Security Solutions or the work they supposedly specialized in. Claire thought I was developing an unhealthy obsession with the house's previous owners. We were sitting on my front porch one evening in early August, drinking wine and watching the sun set through the trees, when she finally voiced her concerns directly. "You bought a house with a mysterious past," she said gently. "That's interesting and everything, but you're spending more time investigating the Brennans than actually living your life. What does it matter why they left or what they built in the basement? It's your house now. Do whatever you want with it and stop chasing ghosts." Her advice was sensible and completely logical, and I knew she was right. But something about the hidden photographs, the dissolved contractor, and Helen's stories about Thomas's secretive behavior had activated an investigative instinct I didn't know I possessed. The house felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, and I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding what had happened here mattered more than I could rationally explain. The decision to tear down the false wall in the basement came in mid-August during one of Marcus's routine inspections of our renovation progress. He'd been measuring the basement to finalize plans for the finishing work when he noticed that the dimensions didn't match the exterior foundation measurements. "We're missing about 6 feet of space somewhere," he told me, tapping his measuring tape against a section of wall that looked identical to all the others. "This wall here, it's not original to the house. Someone built it later, probably to conceal something. Given what we found in that photograph, I'd bet money that your missing metal door is behind this brick facade. Do you want to know what's back there, or would you rather leave some mysteries unsolved?" I didn't need to think about my answer. The sledgehammer felt powerful in my hands as I took the first swing, brick and mortar crumbling under the impact in a shower of dust and debris that made both of us cough. Marcus joined in with a second hammer, and within 20 minutes we'd opened a hole large enough to shine a flashlight through into the cavity beyond. The safe sat there waiting for us like a patient secret, its presence both answer and question. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this thing, building a false wall that perfectly matched the rest of the basement to conceal a cavity that shouldn't exist according to any official blueprint. The safe itself was commercial grade, the kind of security container you'd find in a bank or high-end jewelry store, not a residential basement in a small coastal town. Its combination lock showed signs of regular use despite the years of concealment, the dial moving smoothly under my tentative exploration. Marcus photographed everything before we continued demolishing the false wall, documenting the discovery with the careful attention of someone who understood we might need evidence of what we'd found. Why would Thomas Brennan build a hiding place this elaborate, He asked the question both of us were thinking, and what could possibly be inside that safe that justified this level of security and secrecy? We spent 3 hours that evening trying to open the safe through every method we could imagine short of explosives. Marcus tried common combinations, mathematical sequences, and dates that might have significance to the Brennans based on what little we knew about them. I attempted to feel for clicks or resistance in the dial that might indicate correct numbers, a technique I'd seen in movies that turned out to be completely useless in reality. By 10 o'clock we admitted defeat and sat on the basement floor staring at our discovery, exhausted and frustrated but also electrically aware that we'd found something significant. "Whatever's in there," Claire observed when I called to tell her about the safe, "it's probably going to be disappointing. People don't usually hide their most valuable possessions this elaborately. More likely it's personal documents, family photographs, maybe some cash or jewelry. I'm telling you, you're building this up into something dramatic when the reality will probably be mundane." But Claire was wrong about that, as we discover exactly 72 hours later when a locksmith from Portland finally arrived to deal with our stubborn safe. The locksmith's name was Gerald Pritchard, and he arrived at my house on a Thursday morning in a white van that advertised his services in fading letters across the side panels. He was a compact man in his 60s with reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead and the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades working with delicate mechanisms. Marcus had found him through a professional contact in Portland, and Gerald had driven 3 hours to Ashford Grove specifically because Marcus had described the safe as an unusual challenge that might be interesting. When Gerald descended into my basement and saw what we'd uncovered, his entire demeanor shifted from professional courtesy to genuine fascination. "This is a garrison fortress model," he said, running his hands over the safe's surface with something approaching reverence. "They stopped manufacturing these in 2012. Primarily used by private collectors, high-net-worth individuals, and occasionally by people who needed to protect assets from legal seizure. The security features on this particular model are extraordinary. 3-point locking system, drill-resistant plating, relocker mechanisms that engage if someone tries to force entry. Whoever installed this was serious about protecting whatever's inside." Gerald's tools were laid out on a canvas drop cloth with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He explained his process as he worked, describing how he'd need to manipulate the lock through a combination of technical knowledge and tactile sensitivity. The dial spun under his fingers with a soft clicking that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet basement. Marcus and I watched in silence, barely breathing, as Gerald made notations on a small pad and adjusted his approach based on feedback only he could perceive. The first tumbler fell into place with a sound like a whisper, followed several minutes later by a second. Gerald's face showed intense concentration, his entire world narrowed to the mechanism under his hands and the subtle resistance that told him whether he was moving in the right direction. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, minutes feeling like hours while simultaneously racing past too quickly. The final tumbler engaged with a definitive click that made all 3 of us flinch. Gerald turned the handle slowly, and the massive door swung open on hinges that had been recently oiled despite years of concealment. The interior of the safe was larger than I'd expected, approximately 4 feet deep and lined with what looked like fireproof material. Stacked inside with meticulous organization were plastic storage containers, the kind you'd buy at any office supply store, each one labeled with dates and coded references that meant nothing to me. Gerald stepped back respectfully, his job complete, while Marcus and I stood frozen at the threshold of whatever truth Thomas Brennan had hidden so carefully. "Do you want me to stay?" Gerald asked quietly, "or would you prefer privacy for whatever comes next?" I paid him for his services plus a generous tip for the drive and the discretion, and he departed with a business card and instructions to call if I needed anything else. The basement felt unnaturally quiet after the door closed behind him. Marcus helped me carry the containers upstairs to the kitchen where better light and a comfortable table would make examination easier. There were 7 containers in total, each one sealed with tape that had been applied carefully to prevent moisture or contamination. The dates on the labels ranged from March 2017 to February 2019, spanning nearly 2 years of whatever Thomas had been documenting or preserving. The most recent container was labeled simply Final Documentation, and something about those words made my hands shake as I reached for the tape. Marcus put a hand on my arm gently, his expression serious and concerned. "Whatever's in here," he said slowly, it might be information that's dangerous to know. Thomas and Diane disappeared for a reason, and if that reason is connected to these containers, opening them might put you at risk. Are you sure you want to continue? The question was fair and thoughtful, and I appreciated Marcus's concern. But turning back now felt impossible after weeks of investigation and the discovery of a hidden safe that had required industrial-level security. The first container held financial records, and not the mundane household accounting you'd expect from typical homeowners. These were transaction records for shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers that moved through so many intermediaries that tracing them would require forensic accounting expertise far beyond anything I possessed. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing in patterns that suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than legitimate business operations. Company names appeared and disappeared across multiple documents, with addresses in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and jurisdictions I'd never heard of. Thomas Brennan's name appeared nowhere in these records, but a coded identifier that repeated across multiple transactions suggested these were his operations, carefully hidden behind layers of corporate structure designed to prevent exactly the kind of discovery I was making. Marcus whistled low as he examined the documents, his contractor's practical mind recognizing immediately that we were looking at something illegal, though precisely what crimes these records represented remained unclear. The second container held correspondence, and this is where the story began taking shape in ways I hadn't anticipated. The letters were printed emails, hundreds of them, conversations between Thomas and individuals whose names were redacted or replaced with initials. The earliest messages dated from 2015, discussing what appeared to be investment opportunities in emerging markets. But as the correspondence progressed through 2016 and into 2017, the tone shifted from business discussions to something darker and more desperate. References appeared to regulatory investigations, frozen assets, and legal exposure that was increasing with each passing month. One particularly chilling email from November 2017 read simply, "The auditors have started asking questions we cannot answer. Dissolution or disappearance are our only remaining options." I've begun preparations for the latter. Diane is unaware but will be brought into confidence when timing is appropriate. The house in Oregon will serve as staging ground for exit strategy. The third container was filled with identification documents, and this is when the full scope of Thomas's planning became horrifyingly clear. Inside were passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, and social security cards for identities that were completely fabricated. Thomas and Diane's faces stared out from documents bearing names I didn't recognize, addresses in countries I'd barely heard of, and backstories detailed in accompanying notebooks that read like instruction manuals for assuming new lives. There were bank account details for these false identities, credit histories that had been carefully constructed over months, and even employment records with companies that probably didn't exist beyond paperwork. Thomas had been building escape routes with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what consequences he was fleeing and understood that half measures would result in capture. The passports were high quality, not the crude forgeries you might obtain from criminal networks but professional-grade documents that could pass most security screenings. How much money and planning did this require? Claire wondered when I called her to come see what we discovered. How desperate do you have to be to construct entire false identities and abandon everything you've built? The fourth container held evidence that transformed my understanding of who Thomas Brennan had actually been. Inside were documents related to what appeared to be a large-scale financial fraud, a Ponzi scheme that had operated for nearly 7 years before federal investigators began closing in. Thomas hadn't been a consultant working from home as he'd told neighbors. He'd been running an investment fund that promised extraordinary returns through proprietary trading strategies that existed only on paper. The fund had attracted wealthy investors across multiple states, people who'd trusted Thomas with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, their accumulated life's work. The scheme had been elegant and sophisticated, using early investor payouts to attract larger investments while the actual money disappeared into the shell companies and offshore accounts I'd seen documented in the first container. By late 2018, when federal authorities finally obtained warrants to examine the fund's operations, Thomas had already begun implementing his exit strategy. The safe had been installed in September, the false identities created in October, and by April 2019 when the investigation went public, Thomas and Diane Brennan had simply ceased to exist. The fifth container was perhaps the most disturbing because it contained Thomas's personal justifications for his actions. A leather-bound journal filled with handwritten entries detailed his reasoning, his rationalizations, and his complete lack of remorse for the people whose lives he'd destroyed. He wrote about investors as marks who deserved their losses because they'd been greedy enough to believe in unrealistic returns. He described the fraud as a game that he'd played successfully for years before bad luck and increased regulatory scrutiny had forced an early retirement. There was no acknowledgement of suffering caused, no recognition of families ruined or retirements destroyed. Instead, Thomas wrote with clinical detachment about the mechanics of disappearance, the psychology of maintaining false identities, and the importance of never looking back once the decision to vanish had been made. One entry from March 2019 read, "Diane has finally agreed to the plan after weeks of resistance. She understands now that there is no alternative path that doesn't end with prison time. The house has served its purpose as both home and preparation facility. By month's end, Thomas and Diane Brennan will be dead, and 2 other people will begin their lives somewhere far from American jurisdiction." The 6th container held surveillance materials that suggested Thomas had been monitoring potential threats in the weeks before his disappearance. Photographs of unfamiliar people appeared alongside notes about their movements and routines. Some were labeled as federal agents, others as private investigators hired by suspicious investors, and a few as former business associates who might provide testimony if questioned. Thomas had been tracking these individuals with the paranoia of someone who knew the walls were closing in and wanted advance warning of any approaching danger. Maps of Ashford Grove were marked with routes to avoid and contingency exit strategies if immediate flight became necessary. There were prepaid cell phones still in their packaging, presumably for use during the disappearance, and a detailed timeline that counted down the final weeks before Thomas and Diane would cease to exist. The level of preparation was extraordinary and deeply unsettling, revealing a mind that had accepted the necessity of total reinvention and had approached that task with the same meticulous planning that had characterized his fraudulent investment operations. The 7th and final container was labeled Final Documentation, and I'd saved it for last because something about those words suggested it contained the most important or damaging information. Inside was a USB drive, a single piece of technology amid all the paper records, along with a letter written in Thomas's handwriting and dated April 10, 2019. Exactly 1 week before the last confirmed sighting of the Brennans in Ashford Grove. The letter was addressed to whoever might eventually discover this safe, and it read like a confession meant to be found but only after enough time had passed to make pursuit impossible. To whoever finds this, Thomas had written, "You've discovered the records of a financial operation that ended badly and required extreme measures to avoid consequences I wasn't prepared to face." The USB drive contains complete details of the investment fund, including investor names, amounts lost, and documentation of where the money actually went. I'm leaving this information because I'm not entirely without conscience, despite what my actions might suggest. The investors deserve to know the truth, and perhaps with these records they can recover some portion of their losses through insurance claims or legal action against the shell companies. By the time you read this, I will have been gone for years, living under a different name in a country that doesn't extradite to the United States. Diane is with me, not because she participated in the fraud but because she chose to believe my promises of a better life elsewhere rather than face the shame of being married to a criminal. This house served its purpose as a staging ground and a dead end for anyone trying to follow our trail. The safe was my insurance policy, a way to provide some measure of justice while still protecting my freedom. I don't expect forgiveness and I'm not asking for understanding. I'm simply ensuring that the truth exists somewhere, waiting to be discovered when the time is right. Marcus and I sat in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of systematic fraud and meticulously planned disappearance, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. The USB drive sat on the table between us, a small piece of plastic that contained information federal investigators had presumably been seeking for 5 years. The ethical implications were immediately apparent and deeply complicated. If I turned this evidence over to authorities, I'd be doing the right thing for Thomas's victims, giving them information that might help recover losses or find closure. But I'd also be inserting myself into a federal investigation that had presumably gone cold, inviting scrutiny and attention that could dramatically complicate my life. If I kept the information hidden, I'd be protecting myself from involvement but also denying justice to people who deserved answers and restitution. There was no clear right choice, only competing obligations that pulled in different directions with equal force. Claire arrived within an hour of my phone call, and her reaction to the container's contents was immediate shock followed by practical concern. "You need to call the police," she said firmly after examining just a fraction of the documentation. "This isn't something you can sit on or handle privately. There are victims out there who lost everything, and you're holding evidence that might help them. It doesn't matter that it's complicated or inconvenient. You have a moral obligation to come forward with what you found." Her position was clear and uncompromising, exactly what I'd expected from someone whose ethical framework tended toward absolute principles rather than situational nuance. But Marcus had a different perspective, one shaped by decades of working in construction where he'd encountered questionable practices and learned when intervention helped and when it simply created more problems. "Think carefully about what happens after you make that call," he cautioned, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. "The federal government is going to take over your house for weeks or months while they process this as a crime scene. Every surface will be examined, every document cataloged, every aspect of your renovation disrupted while they do their investigation. You'll be questioned extensively about how you found this material and why you didn't immediately report it. Your name will probably appear in news coverage because this is a significant recovery of evidence in a fraud case that affected multiple states. Is that really what you want to invite into your life?" We debated for hours that evening, weighing moral obligations against practical consequences and trying to determine what responsibility I actually bore for information I discovered accidentally. I hadn't been looking for evidence of fraud when I bought the house. I'd simply wanted a renovation project and a fresh start after my divorce. The safe had been Thomas's secret, carefully hidden and meant to stay concealed until he was far beyond any possibility of prosecution. By finding it through legitimate renovation work, had I become obligated to act on its contents, or was I simply an innocent party who'd stumbled into someone else's crimes? The question had no easy answer, and every perspective seemed valid depending on how you weighted different factors. Natalie, when I called her for advice, immediately sided with Claire's position that disclosure was mandatory. But she added a caveat that complicated matters further. "You should probably talk to a lawyer before you contact law enforcement," she suggested. "Make sure you understand your own legal exposure and what protections you might need. Finding evidence of a crime doesn't automatically make you complicit, but you want to be certain you're protected before you hand over material that's this significant. The authorities might have questions about whether you should have reported this sooner, or whether you've already examined the USB drive contents, or what else you might have found that you're not disclosing." The USB drive remained unopened on my kitchen counter for 3 days while I wrestled with the decision about what to do next. Part of me wanted to plug it into my computer and see exactly what information Thomas had preserved, to understand the full scope of his fraud and the specific details of how he destroyed so many lives. But another part recognized that examining the drive would constitute destroying potential evidence or at least complicating the chain of custody that investigators would need to establish. If I looked at the contents, I'd have to disclose that fact, and any claims that I'd simply been a passive finder of hidden materials would become less credible. The drive represented a threshold I couldn't uncross once I'd stepped over it, and my uncertainty about the right path forward kept me frozen in indecision that grew more uncomfortable with each passing day. Claire stopped by every evening to check whether I'd made a decision, and her frustration with my hesitation became increasingly obvious despite her efforts to remain supportive. "This isn't actually a difficult choice," she said on the third evening, accepting a glass of wine and settling into a chair at my kitchen table. "There are people who've been suffering for 5 years, wondering what happened to their money and whether the person who stole it would ever face consequences. You're holding information that could provide answers and maybe even recovery of assets. How is there any question about what you should do?" But Marcus understood my hesitation in ways that Claire couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. "You're afraid," he said simply during a phone conversation on the 4th day after we'd opened the safe. "Not of doing the right thing, but of what that right thing will cost you personally. You bought this house to rebuild your life after a difficult divorce. You've been working constantly on renovations, investing your time and money and energy into creating something that's yours. Now you've discovered that your house was the staging ground for a criminal's escape plan, and revealing that information will turn everything upside down. That's a legitimate fear, and pretending it isn't doesn't make you a better person. It just makes you dishonest about your own motivations." His words were harsh but accurate, cutting through the rationalizations I'd been constructing to justify my inaction. I was afraid of the disruption, the attention, the transformation of my renovation project into a crime scene that would be photographed and examined and discussed in news articles I'd never be able to escape. The decision finally crystallized on a Sunday morning when I was drinking coffee on my front porch and watched Helen Garrett working in her garden next door. She moved slowly among her flowers, tending to plants with the patient care of someone who'd been nurturing this same plot of ground for decades. Helen represented stability and continuity, a life lived in one place with consistency and care. Thomas Brennan represented the opposite, a person who destroyed stability for others while planning his own escape from consequences. Sitting there watching Helen work, I realized that my hesitation to report what I'd found was allowing Thomas's final strategy to succeed. He'd hidden the evidence assuming it would either never be discovered or that whoever found it would be too uncertain or self-interested to act on it. By remaining silent, I was becoming complicit in his escape plan, protecting him through my inaction just as surely as if I'd helped him cross the border into Canada 5 years earlier. The realization wasn't comfortable, but it was clarifying in a way that ended my internal debate. Detective Raymond Cole worked out of the Ashford Grove Police Department, but when I called and explained generally what I'd discovered without revealing specific details, he immediately connected me with FBI Special Agent Victoria Stern, who'd been the lead investigator on the Brennan fraud case. Agent Stern was based in Portland and suggested we meet at the county sheriff's office in Ashford Grove, neutral territory that would allow her to examine the materials while keeping the initial review relatively low profile. She arrived on Tuesday afternoon, a tall woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and the controlled energy of someone who'd learned to be patient during investigations that moved at institutional speeds. Her handshake was firm and professional, and she listened to my explanation of the discovery without interruption, taking notes on a tablet that she held with practiced efficiency. When I finished describing the 7 containers and their contents, she asked a single question that told me she understood immediately the significance of what I'd found. The USB drive, have you accessed its contents? When I confirmed I hadn't, her shoulders relaxed slightly, and something that might have been relief crossed her face briefly before her professional mask returned. The next 6 hours were consumed by Agent Stern's preliminary examination of the materials I'd discovered, with Detective Cole assisting and Marcus present as a witness to how and when we'd found the safe. Agent Stern photographed everything methodically, documenting the containers, their contents, and their organization before beginning her detailed review of individual documents. Her reactions were carefully controlled, but occasional comments revealed how significant this discovery was for an investigation that had gone frustratingly cold. "These shell company records are extraordinary," she said at one point while examining financial documents from the second container. "We'd identified some of these entities during our original investigation, but we couldn't penetrate the ownership structure or trace where the money had gone. If this USB drive contains what Thomas claimed in his letter, we might be able to recover assets we'd assumed were permanently hidden. The investors in his fund had been waiting 5 years for any kind of resolution. This could finally provide some answers and maybe even meaningful restitution." The process of cataloging and transferring the materials to FBI custody took 3 days, during which my house became exactly what Marcus had predicted it would be, a crime scene under federal investigation. Additional agents arrived from Portland with specialized equipment to examine the basement, photograph the safe and its concealment, and process every surface for potential evidence I might have missed. They were professional and respectful of my property, but their presence transformed my home into something that felt alien and uncomfortable. I stayed with Claire during most of the investigation period, unable to bear watching strangers examine spaces I'd been working to make my own. The Victorian house on Maple Ridge Drive had been my fresh start project, and now it was evidence in a federal fraud investigation that would probably be discussed in court proceedings and news articles for months or years to come. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd bought the house partly because of its mysterious past, and that mystery had now consumed my present in ways I'd never anticipated or wanted. Agent Stern kept me informed throughout the initial analysis of Thomas's materials, providing updates that revealed just how devastating his fraud had been. The USB drive contained complete documentation of 47 investors who'd lost a combined total of $12.3 million to Thomas's scheme. Some had lost modest amounts, $20,000 or $30,000 that represented years of careful saving. Others had invested their entire retirement portfolios, 6 or 7-figure sums that should have been generating income for their old age but instead had disappeared into shell companies and offshore accounts that existed only to facilitate theft. The youngest victim had been 32 years old when she'd invested her inheritance from deceased parents, trusting Thomas's promises of extraordinary returns that would allow her to buy a house and start a family. The oldest victim had been 79, a widower who'd given Thomas his late wife's life insurance payout because the promised returns would let him leave meaningful inheritances to his grandchildren. Every story was heartbreaking. Every loss represented dreams destroyed and futures stolen by someone who'd viewed their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in his personal enrichment. The media attention began exactly as Marcus had warned it would, slowly at first and then building into something overwhelming that invaded every aspect of my life in Ashford Grove. A local newspaper ran the initial story with a headline that read "Hidden Safe Reveals Evidence in 5-Year-Old Fraud Case," and within 48 hours the piece had been picked up by regional outlets and eventually national news services. My name appeared in every article despite Agent Stern's attempts to keep my identity protected, and reporters began showing up at the house asking for interviews and photographs of the basement where we discovered the safe. I declined every request, but that didn't stop them from filming the exterior of my Victorian house or interviewing neighbors who had varying levels of actual knowledge about what had happened. Helen Garrett refused all interview requests with a firmness I appreciated, but other residents of Maple Ridge Drive were less discreet, sharing speculation and rumor that bore little resemblance to actual facts. The attention from Thomas's victims was harder to navigate emotionally than the media scrutiny. Agent Stern had provided my contact information to several of the defrauded investors, people who wanted to thank me personally for discovering evidence that might help them recover some portion of their losses. Their gratitude was genuine and touching, but it came wrapped in stories of suffering that were difficult to hear without feeling complicit simply by virtue of living in the house where Thomas had planned his escape. A woman named Patricia Lawson called from Minnesota one evening in late September, her voice shaking as she explained that she'd invested her teacher's pension with Thomas's fund in 2016, believing his promises that the returns would supplement her retirement income. When the fraud was exposed in 2019, she'd been 63 years old and looking forward to retiring within 2 years. Instead, she'd lost $340,000 and had been forced to continue working, taking substitute teaching positions and weekend tutoring jobs just to make ends meet. "Because of what you found," she told me through tears, "I might be able to actually retire before I'm too old to enjoy it. The FBI says they've traced some of my money to accounts they can potentially recover from. I know you probably don't want to hear from strangers telling you their problems, but I needed you to know what your discovery means to people like me." Each conversation with a victim added weight to my understanding of what Thomas had done and why his disappearance had been so carefully planned. These weren't abstract financial crimes committed against wealthy investors who could afford the losses. They were intimate betrayals of trust, often targeting people who'd been referred to Thomas by friends or family members who'd received early payouts that seemed to validate his promised returns. The psychological damage extended beyond the financial losses, destroying relationships between people who'd made referrals and those who'd acted on them, creating shame and guilt that persisted long after the money had disappeared. A man named Robert Chin explained during one phone call that he'd introduced his brother-in-law to Thomas's fund in 2017, and when the fraud was exposed, his sister had divorced her husband partly because the financial stress had become unbearable. Robert's relationship with his sister had never recovered, poisoned by her belief that he should have been more careful about vetting an investment opportunity before making referrals. "The money was devastating to lose," Robert said quietly, "but the destruction of my family has been even worse. We used to gather for holidays and celebrate birthdays together. Now my sister won't return my calls and my nephews have been taught to view me as the person who ruined their father." The forensic accounting work that followed the discovery of Thomas's materials took months and involved specialists from multiple agencies who'd been brought in to untangle the complex web of shell companies and offshore transfers. Agent Stern called periodically with updates that revealed the scope of the operation and how much effort Thomas had invested in making his stolen money difficult to trace. The funds had moved through 14 different jurisdictions across 5 continents, with each transfer structured to fall just below reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic scrutiny. Some of the money had been converted into cryptocurrency and then back into traditional currency through exchanges that had since been shut down for regulatory violations. Other portions had been invested in real estate through holding companies that existed only on paper, with properties scattered across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia where enforcement of financial crimes was inconsistent at best. The complexity was extraordinary and suggested that Thomas had received expert assistance in structuring his fraud and planning his exit, though investigators hadn't yet identified who might have provided that expertise or whether they faced prosecution themselves. My renovation work on the house continued through the fall, though the enthusiasm I'd felt during the summer had been replaced by a kind of grim determination to complete what I'd started. The kitchen and bathrooms were finished, looking exactly as I'd envisioned them during the planning stages, but their completion felt hollow given everything else that had happened. Marcus remained a steady presence throughout the ongoing investigation, helping me navigate interactions with federal agents who still occasionally needed access to the basement or wanted to re-examine how we discovered the false wall. He'd become more than just a contractor during these months, evolving into something like a friend who understood the complexity of my situation without offering simplistic advice about how I should feel or what I should do next. We'd sit on the front porch some evenings after work crews had departed, drinking beer and not talking about the investigation or the victims or the media attention, just existing in comfortable silence that acknowledged shared experience without requiring constant processing of its meaning. Claire's reaction to the ongoing situation was more complicated and ultimately revealed fractures in our friendship that had probably existed long before the safe discovery but had been manageable when the stakes were lower. She'd been unequivocally supportive of my decision to report what I'd found, but as the consequences of that decision unfolded through the fall, her patience with my ambivalence about the attention began wearing thin. "You did the right thing," she'd remind me whenever I expressed frustration about another reporter calling or another victim reaching out with their story. "Yes, it's been disruptive and stressful, but you helped people recover money they thought was gone forever. You should feel good about that, not conflicted." Her inability to understand that I could simultaneously believe I'd made the correct choice while still resenting the personal cost suggested a rigidity in her thinking that bothered me more as time passed. "Not every right decision feels good," I tried to explain during one particularly tense conversation. "Sometimes you do what's morally correct and it still makes your life harder in ways you didn't choose or want. I can be glad the victims are getting some justice while also being exhausted by the constant intrusion into my privacy." Natalie drove up from Eugene in early October to see how I was holding up and to inspect the renovation progress that had continued despite everything else happening. She walked through the house with the critical eye of someone who'd watched me make questionable decisions throughout my life and had learned to offer honest assessments rather than false encouragement. "The place looks great," she admitted after completing her tour of the updated spaces. "You've done amazing work here, and honestly it's impressive that you kept going with the renovations while dealing with federal investigations and media attention. But I have to ask, and please don't get defensive, are you actually happy here? Is this house worth everything it's cost you emotionally?" The question was fair and I appreciated her directness even though I didn't have a clear answer. Some days I loved the house and felt proud of what I'd accomplished in transforming it from abandoned wreck into a genuinely beautiful home. Other days I resented every board and nail, wishing I'd chosen a sterile condo with no history and no hidden safes containing evidence of crimes I'd never wanted to know about. The preliminary hearing for the civil cases that victims had filed against Thomas's estate took place in Portland on a gray November morning that matched my mood perfectly. I'd been subpoenaed to testify about the discovery of the safe and the materials inside it, and Agent Stern had prepared me for the experience by explaining that I'd be asked straightforward questions about facts rather than opinions or interpretations. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from television dramas, and the atmosphere was formal but not intimidating. Approximately 30 people sat in the gallery, most of them victims or their attorneys, all watching with intense interest as I was sworn in and took my seat in the witness box. The attorney representing the victims' collective interests was a woman named Sandra Martinez who had a gentle manner that made her questions feel conversational rather than adversarial. I described purchasing the house, discovering the photographs behind the bathroom wall, finding the discrepancies in the basement measurements, and ultimately opening the false wall to reveal the safe. The testimony took less than an hour, but the weight of those 30 pairs of eyes watching me was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. During a break in the proceedings, several of the victims approached me in the courthouse hallway to introduce themselves and express gratitude that felt disproportionate to what I'd actually done. A couple in their late 60s named Frank and Dorothy Morrison had lost $400,000 to Thomas's scheme, money they'd accumulated over 40 years of running a small business that they'd sold in 2018 with plans to retire comfortably. "We'd been living on Social Security and what little savings we had left," Dorothy explained, her husband standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder. "The FBI says they've recovered about 60% of what we lost, which means we can actually consider retiring for real instead of working until we die. You gave us our future back." Her words were generous but also uncomfortable because I hadn't given them anything intentionally. I'd simply renovated a house and stumbled across evidence that happened to be valuable to their legal claims. The difference between deliberate heroism and accidental discovery felt significant to me, though clearly not to the people whose lives had been affected by what I'd found. The forensic analysis of the USB drive revealed details that made Thomas's fraud even more disturbing than the initial reports had suggested. He'd kept meticulous records not just of financial transactions but also of personal information about his victims, notes about their vulnerabilities and the specific appeals that had convinced them to invest. One file labeled Prospect Psychology contained Thomas's assessments of potential investors, describing them in clinical terms that reduced human beings to marks whose emotional needs could be exploited for profit. A widow grieving her husband's death had been targeted with promises that the investment returns would honor his memory by securing her financial future. A young couple expecting their first child had been approached with plans about education funding and generational wealth. Thomas had identified what each person most desperately wanted and had crafted his pitch to position himself as the solution to those specific needs. The calculated cruelty of this approach was somehow more offensive than the actual theft, revealing a predator who'd studied his prey with scientific detachment before destroying them financially. Agent Stearns shared these details during a meeting in December where she provided an update on the investigation's progress and the likelihood of recovering additional assets. "We've identified accounts in Cyprus and Panama that contain approximately $3.7 million that we believe came from investor funds," she explained, showing me documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all I understood about international finance. "The recovery process will take time because we need to navigate each country's legal system and demonstrate that the funds are proceeds of fraud. But we're optimistic that we'll eventually be able to return a substantial portion to the victims. The current estimate is that investors might recover between 50 and 70% of their original investments, which is extraordinary for a case where the perpetrator successfully disappeared. Without your discovery of that safe and its contents, the recovery rate would have been close to zero." Her words were meant to reassure me that the disruption to my life had served a meaningful purpose, and intellectually I understood and accepted that truth. Emotionally, I remained conflicted about the cost of that purpose and whether I'd have made the same choice to report the discovery if I'd fully understood the consequences before making the call. The question of what had actually happened to Thomas and Diane Brennan remained unanswered despite months of investigation and international cooperation. Agent Stearns' team had identified several possible sightings based on the false identity documents we'd found in the safe, but none had been definitively confirmed. A couple matching their description had been spotted in Costa Rica in late 2019, living in a coastal town popular with American expatriates. Another potential sighting placed them in Portugal in early 2020, shortly before international travel restrictions made movement between countries more difficult. The most credible lead suggested they might be in Southeast Asia, possibly Vietnam or Thailand, where the cost of living was low enough that even a fraction of the stolen money could support a comfortable lifestyle indefinitely. But without current photographs or concrete evidence of their location, the pursuit had stalled into a waiting game where investigators hoped for mistakes or chance encounters that might reveal where the Brennans had ultimately settled. The reality that they'd probably escaped permanently and would never face criminal prosecution was frustrating for the victims and unsatisfying as an ending to a story that had consumed so much of my life over the past several months. Helen Garrett became an unexpected source of comfort during the difficult weeks after the preliminary hearing. She'd stop by occasionally with food she'd prepared or garden flowers she thought might brighten my kitchen, and she'd sit with me on the front porch sharing stories about the neighborhood's history that had nothing to do with the Brennans or their crimes. Helen had lived through enough life experience to understand that sometimes people needed distraction rather than constant processing of difficult situations, and her visits provided exactly that kind of relief. She told me about the families who'd lived in my house before Thomas purchased it, describing children who'd grown up in those rooms and couples who'd celebrated anniversaries in that dining room. Her stories populated the Victorian with memories that predated the fraud and reminded me that the house's identity wasn't limited to its most recent owner's crimes. "This place has seen joy and sorrow long before you arrived," Helen said during one evening visit as we watched the sun set through the trees. "Thomas Brennan was just one chapter in a much longer story, and he doesn't get to define what this house means or what it becomes under your ownership." The holiday season approached with a heaviness that made celebration feel inappropriate despite Claire's insistence that I needed to maintain some normalcy in my life. She wanted to host Christmas dinner at my house, arguing that the renovated kitchen and dining room deserved to be used for their intended purpose rather than remaining empty while I brooded about federal investigations. I resisted initially, uncomfortable with the idea of gathering people in a space that still felt contaminated by its association with Thomas's crimes. But eventually, I agreed to a small dinner with just Claire, Marcus, Natalie, and Helen, a group of people who'd supported me through the chaos and deserved acknowledgement of that support. The evening was quieter than typical holiday celebrations, with conversation carefully avoiding topics related to the safe or the investigation, but there was warmth in the gathering that reminded me why I'd wanted this house in the first place. Not for its potential as an investment or its architectural character, but for its possibility as a space where genuine connection could happen away from the judgment and complications that had defined my marriage to Kevin. The financial recovery for Thomas's victims began materializing in January when the first distributions from seized accounts were processed and sent to investors who'd filed claims. The amounts were smaller than the original losses but significant enough to make meaningful differences in people's lives. Patricia Lawson called to tell me she'd received a check for just over $200,000, approximately 60% of what she'd originally invested. "It's not everything I lost," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but it's enough that I can actually retire this year instead of working until I'm 70. I'm putting in my notice at the school district next week, and I'm going to spend my retirement traveling to places I thought I'd never be able to afford. Thank you seems inadequate for what your discovery has made possible, but please know that you've literally given me my life back." Similar calls came from other victims throughout the month, each one sharing news of recovered funds and the plans those recoveries had made possible. Robert Chen reported that the distribution had allowed him to begin repairing his relationship with his sister, offering to split his recovered amount with her as a gesture toward healing the damage his referral had caused. "The money doesn't fix everything," he admitted, "but it removes the constant financial stress that's been poisoning every interaction we've had for the past 5 years." Marcus finished the basement renovation in February, transforming the space where we discovered the safe into a beautiful finished room with proper flooring, painted walls, and lighting that eliminated the dungeon atmosphere that had characterized it when I'd first seen the house. The safe itself had been removed by federal agents as evidence, and the cavity behind the false wall had been properly sealed and finished to match the rest of the basement. Standing in that completed space, it was almost impossible to imagine what had been hidden there just months earlier. Marcus had done excellent work, and the transformation was so complete that future owners would never know about the safe unless they specifically researched the house's history. "Do you think you'll stay here long term?" Marcus asked as we did a final walkthrough of the completed basement, "or has everything that happened made this place feel too complicated to call home?" The question echoed what Natalie had asked months earlier, and I still didn't have a definitive answer. Some days I could imagine growing old in this Victorian house, hosting future holiday dinners and eventually becoming the neighborhood fixture that Helen currently represented. Other days I fantasized about selling the property and starting over somewhere with no history and no association with crimes I'd never wanted to understand. The 1-year anniversary of discovering the safe arrived in mid-August with surprisingly little fanfare. The media had moved on to other stories months earlier, and even the victims' phone calls had tapered off as the initial gratitude settled into the background of lives that were slowly returning to normal. Agent Stern sent a brief email updating me on the investigation's status and thanking me again for my cooperation throughout the process. The Brennan case remained open technically, but active pursuit had been scaled back given the lack of concrete leads about their current location. "We'll continue monitoring for any indicators that they've surfaced somewhere," she wrote, "but realistically they've probably established themselves successfully under new identities in a country that won't cooperate with extradition requests. The victims have received substantial recovery of their losses, which is the best outcome we could have hoped for given the circumstances. Your discovery made that possible, and I hope you found some peace with how everything unfolded." Her words were professional and kind, and they represented a form of closure that I appreciated even if it didn't fully resolve my complicated feelings about the past year. Claire and I had drifted apart somewhat during the months since the safe discovery, our friendship strained by disagreements about how I should have responded to the attention and whether my ambivalence was justified or simply self-indulgent. We still saw each other occasionally, but the easy intimacy that had characterized our relationship had been replaced by a careful politeness that acknowledged distance without directly addressing its causes. Natalie suggested during one phone conversation that some friendships weren't meant to survive major life changes, and that perhaps Claire and I had simply run our course as close friends. It's okay to outgrow relationships, she said gently. You've both changed over the past year, and maybe you don't fit together the way you used to. That doesn't mean either of you did anything wrong. It just means you're different people now with different needs from your friendships. Her perspective was probably accurate, though accepting it meant acknowledging loss that added to the cumulative weight of everything else the safe discovery had cost me. Marcus remained a consistent presence throughout that first year and into the second, helping with smaller projects around the house and occasionally stopping by just to check how I was doing. Our relationship had evolved into something that defied easy categorization, more than professional association but not quite friendship in the traditional sense. He was someone who'd witnessed the same discovery I had and understood its impact without needing constant explanation or reassurance that my reactions were justified. We developed a shorthand communication that allowed for honesty without judgment, and I valued that rare quality more than I'd initially recognized. One evening in late September, as we sat on the porch drinking beer and watching the light fade through the trees, Marcus said something that captured what I'd been struggling to articulate for months. You know what I think about when I remember finding that safe? Not the drama or the investigation or even the victims getting their money back. I think about the moment right after we opened the false wall, when we saw it sitting there and realized we'd found something significant. For just a few seconds before we understood what it meant, it was pure discovery, the excitement of uncovering a secret. That feeling was real and good, and it existed separately from all the complicated aftermath. You're allowed to remember that moment and value it even though what followed was difficult. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had become something different than what I'd imagined when I'd first seen Victor Kane's listing, but it was undeniably mine in ways that went beyond legal ownership. Every renovated room reflected decisions I'd made and work I'd contributed, and the structure itself had been transformed from abandoned wreck into a genuinely beautiful home. The basement where we'd found the safe was now my favorite space, a quiet retreat where I could work or read without the associations that contaminated other rooms. I'd furnished it with comfortable furniture and good lighting, creating an environment that honored what the space had become rather than what it had briefly contained. Helen's words about the house's longer story had proven accurate. Thomas Brennan's chapter had been dramatic and consequential, but it was ultimately just one part of a history that extended decades into the past and would continue long after I'd moved on. The Victorian had survived worse than a hidden safe and a fraudulent owner, and it would survive whatever came next with the same patient endurance that characterized old houses that had outlasted multiple generations of human drama. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, 18 months after we discovered the safe. I was drinking coffee on the front porch when the mail carrier handed me a stack that included the usual bills and advertisements along with a single envelope that stood out because of its international postage stamps and unfamiliar return address. The handwriting was neat and precise, the kind of careful lettering that suggested someone had taken time to make their message legible. The return address listed a post office box in Lisbon, Portugal, with no name attached. Something about the anonymity made my stomach tighten even before I opened it, an instinctive recognition that this correspondence would complicate the fragile peace I'd been building over the past year. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same careful handwriting, and the opening line confirmed what I'd already suspected from the Portuguese postage. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I'm writing to acknowledge what you found in the house I once owned. The words were matter-of-fact and direct, lacking any greeting or pleasantries that might soften the shock of receiving communication from someone who'd been missing for over 6 years. I continued reading with hands that had started trembling slightly, coffee forgotten on the porch railing beside me. You've probably wondered whether I know about the discovery of my safe and the materials inside it. The answer is yes. I've been monitoring news coverage and legal proceedings through sources I established before leaving the United States. I watched your testimony during the preliminary hearing via video that was posted online, and I've tracked the victim compensation process as recovered assets were distributed. I'm writing now because enough time has passed that I feel I can communicate without creating additional complications for you or risks for myself. The letter continued for 3 pages, single-spaced and comprehensive in ways that suggested Thomas had been planning this communication for months. He explained his current situation without providing details that might compromise his security, confirming that he and Diane were living under assumed identities in a country he wouldn't name. The reference to Lisbon was misdirection, he admitted, a mail forwarding service he'd established to obscure his actual location. They'd been moving periodically since their initial disappearance, staying in each place long enough to establish routines but not so long that they became memorable to neighbors or local authorities. The lifestyle was comfortable but constrained, limited by the need for constant vigilance and the impossibility of forming genuine relationships with people who knew them only through carefully constructed false histories. Diane struggles with the isolation, Thomas wrote, though she's adapted better than I expected. We have enough money to live well, but wealth without purpose or community becomes hollow quickly. I don't expect sympathy and I'm not asking for understanding. I'm simply providing context for decisions that probably seem incomprehensible from your perspective. The portion of the letter that addressed me directly was both apologetic and defensive, a combination that revealed Thomas's continued inability to fully accept responsibility for his choices. I never intended for you to become involved in the aftermath of my exit, he wrote. The safe was meant to be discovered eventually, but I'd assumed it would remain hidden for at least a decade, long enough that the investigation would have closed and the victims would have moved on with their lives. Your renovation work was more thorough than I anticipated, and your decision to report what you found was both predictable and inconvenient. I don't blame you for coming forward, that was clearly the ethical choice from your position, but I hope you understand that your discovery complicated lives beyond just the victims who received compensation. Diane and I have had to relocate twice since the news broke that the safe had been found, abandoning carefully constructed identities and starting over in new countries because we couldn't be certain that investigators hadn't obtained information that might lead to our location. The letter's conclusion was the most disturbing section because it revealed that Thomas had been watching me specifically, tracking my life through online searches and possibly other methods he didn't fully disclose. I know the attention has been difficult for you, he wrote. The media coverage, the victim outreach, the disruption to your renovation plans and your quiet life in Ashford Grove. I'm sorry that my choices created those consequences for someone who had no connection to my fraud and simply wanted to restore a beautiful old house. But I want you to understand something important about the safe and why I left those materials behind. I could have destroyed all evidence before disappearing. I could have burned documents, wiped drives, and left investigators with nothing to trace. I chose not to do that because despite everything else, I wanted there to be some possibility of justice for the people I'd defrauded. The safe was my confession and my penance, a way to provide restitution while still protecting my freedom. You were the instrument through which that penance was delivered, and while I regret the burden that placed on you, I'm grateful that you chose to act rather than ignore what you'd found. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of manipulation and self-justification that made my anger build with progressive intensity. Thomas had written as if we were collaborators in some grand moral project, as if his decision to hide evidence rather than destroy it deserved admiration rather than contempt. The notion that leaving a safe full of incriminating materials constituted penance was absurd, a rationalization that allowed him to feel virtuous about choices that were actually entirely self-serving. If he genuinely wanted justice for his victims, he could have turned himself in and cooperated with authorities to help recover stolen funds. Instead, he'd created an elaborate escape plan, stolen millions of dollars, and disappeared into a new life while the people he defrauded suffered the consequences of his crimes. The safe hadn't been penance. It had been insurance, a way to potentially reduce sentences if he was ever caught by demonstrating some minimal level of cooperation through preserved evidence. My first instinct was to contact Agent Stern immediately and provide her with the letter that might contain clues about Thomas's actual location. But something made me hesitate, a complicated mixture of exhaustion with the investigation and reluctance to invite federal authorities back into my life after finally achieving some distance from their constant presence. The letter's Portuguese postage was clearly misdirection, as Thomas had admitted, which meant the physical envelope probably contained no useful information about where he was actually living. His communication had been carefully constructed to acknowledge my role in the victim compensation while simultaneously revealing nothing that might aid in his capture. Turning the letter over to investigators would restart a process I'd worked hard to close, bringing reporters back to my door and transforming me once again into a minor character in a story that I desperately wanted to exit. Marcus arrived that evening for dinner we'd planned earlier in the week, and I showed him the letter without preamble as soon as he walked through the door. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to anger and finally settling into something like resignation. "This guy is unbelievable," he said after finishing the 3rd page and setting it down on my kitchen counter. "He's still trying to control the narrative, still positioning himself as someone who made difficult but understandable choices rather than someone who deliberately destroyed people's lives for personal profit. And the fact that he's been monitoring you specifically, tracking your testimony and following news coverage, that's genuinely creepy. You need to report this to the FBI immediately. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected and probably what I should have felt more strongly myself. But my exhaustion with the entire situation made me question whether further involvement would serve any purpose beyond creating additional disruption. We debated the ethics of my hesitation over dinner, with Marcus firmly advocating for disclosure while I played devil's advocate about whether the letter actually provided any actionable information. He's already admitted the Portuguese postage is fake, I argued, pushing pasta around my plate without much appetite. The envelope will be useless for tracing his location, and the letter itself is just him justifying his choices and expressing hollow regret for involving me. What do I gain by reporting it except more attention and more questions from investigators who'll want to know why I hesitated before coming forward? Marcus's response was characteristically direct. It's not about what you gain, it's about doing what's right regardless of personal cost. That was the principle you followed when you reported the safe, and it should apply equally to this letter. Thomas Brennan is a fugitive from justice who's taunting you with his continued freedom. The fact that he's watching you specifically is disturbing and potentially threatening. You can't just ignore this because you're tired of dealing with the aftermath of his crimes. Sleep was impossible that night as I lay in bed replaying arguments about obligation and self-protection. Marcus was right that reporting the letter was technically the correct action, continuing the pattern of disclosure I'd established when I'd first discovered the safe. But I was equally right that doing so would restart a cycle of attention and investigation that had only recently subsided enough to let me reclaim some normalcy. The tension between these competing considerations left me paralyzed in a familiar pattern of indecision that had characterized my initial response to finding the safe. Part of me wondered whether I'd learned anything from that earlier experience or if I was destined to repeat the same cycle of uncertainty and delayed action every time Thomas's crimes intersected with my life. The thought was depressing and made me question my capacity for decisive action even in situations where the right choice should have been obvious. I called Agent Stern the following morning and told her about the letter without mentioning my overnight debate about whether to report it at all. She asked me to photograph each page and email the images immediately while preserving the original envelope and letter in a plastic bag to protect any potential forensic evidence. Her reaction when she called back after reviewing the photographs confirmed that the letter was significant despite Thomas's precautions. This is the first direct communication we've received from Brennan since his disappearance, she explained, her voice carrying excitement that professional restraint couldn't completely mask. Even if the Portuguese postage is misdirection, there might be trace evidence on the paper or envelope that tells us something about where he's actually living. Paper manufacturers use different processes in different regions, and sometimes those variations can be detected through analysis. Plus, the fact that he's monitoring American news coverage and legal proceedings gives us information about his internet habits and possible vulnerabilities we can exploit. I'm sending someone to collect the letter this afternoon, and we'll process it through our forensic lab as quickly as possible. The federal investigation that I'd thought was winding down suddenly reactivated with renewed energy focused on analyzing every aspect of Thomas's letter. Specialists examined the paper and ink, looking for manufacturing signatures that might indicate geographic origin. Linguists analyzed his word choices and sentence structures for patterns that might reveal something about his current location or state of mind. Computer forensics experts tried to determine how he might be accessing American websites and news coverage without leaving digital traces that could be followed back to his physical location. The process consumed weeks and ultimately yielded frustratingly little concrete information beyond confirming what we'd already known. Thomas was alive, living abroad under a false identity, and maintaining enough awareness of American news to track developments related to his case. The Portuguese postage was indeed misdirection, routed through a mail forwarding service that Thomas had probably established years earlier specifically for communications like this one. The media attention that accompanied news of Thomas's letter was even more intense than the coverage of the safe discovery because now there was an active fugitive angle that journalists found irresistible. Headlines described Thomas as taunting authorities with his communication, portraying him as an arrogant criminal who believed he was untouchable in his foreign hiding place. My role in receiving the letter made me newsworthy again despite my efforts to avoid interviews and maintain privacy. Reporters camped outside my house for several days, filming the Victorian and trying to catch me coming or going so they could ask questions I had no interest in answering. Helen Garrett became an unexpected ally during this period, positioning herself in her front yard during peak reporter hours and firmly redirecting anyone who approached my property toward the public street where they were legally allowed to stand but couldn't harass me directly. She'd lived through enough decades to have developed a commanding presence that made even aggressive journalists think twice about ignoring her instructions to leave me alone. Claire called during the height of the media frenzy with an observation that was both supportive and subtly critical in ways that characterized our strained friendship. "You must be exhausted with all this attention again," she said after we'd exchanged initial pleasantries. "I saw some of the news coverage and the headlines are completely sensationalized. But I have to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, did you hesitate at all before reporting the letter? I'm not saying you should have kept it secret, obviously reporting it was the right thing to do. I'm just curious whether you struggled with the decision given how much the first disclosure disrupted your life." Her question was perceptive in uncomfortable ways, identifying the hesitation I'd been reluctant to admit even to myself. I acknowledged that I'd debated overnight before calling Agent Stern, and Claire's response was immediate and disappointed. "That makes me sad," she said quietly. "Not because you ultimately did the right thing, but because you had to struggle with it at all. The fact that self-protection competed with doing what was obviously correct suggests you've let the difficulty of the past year compromise your moral clarity. I understand being tired of attention, but some obligations exist regardless of how inconvenient they are." Her words stung precisely because they contained truth I didn't want to acknowledge. I had hesitated, and that hesitation did reflect a prioritization of personal comfort over ethical obligation. The fact that I'd eventually reported the letter didn't fully erase the moral failure of needing to debate whether I would do so. Claire's criticism felt harsh but wasn't entirely unfair, and it crystallized the growing distance between us into something that might be permanent. We ended the conversation politely, but I knew with certainty that our friendship had fundamentally changed in ways that probably couldn't be repaired. She viewed the world through a framework of clear moral principles that allowed little room for the messy reality of competing obligations and exhaustion with doing the right thing repeatedly at personal cost. I developed a more nuanced and perhaps more compromised perspective that recognized ethical action wasn't always sustainable when it required constant sacrifice of your own well-being. Natalie's reaction to the letter and my hesitation was characteristically pragmatic and non-judgmental. "Of course you struggled with whether to report it," she said during a phone call where I'd confessed my overnight debate. "You've been through 18 months of investigation, testimony, media attention, and emotional exhaustion. The fact that you needed to consider your options before inviting more of that into your life doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. And ultimately you did report the letter, so what's the problem?" Her perspective was comforting even if it didn't fully absolve the guilt I felt about my hesitation. The problem, I tried to explain, was that the struggle itself revealed something about my character that I didn't particularly like. I wanted to be someone who automatically did the right thing without needing to weigh personal consequences. The fact that I wasn't that person felt like a failure regardless of my eventual actions. The investigation into Thomas's letter continued through November and into December with diminishing returns that eventually led to Agent Stern's acknowledgement that they'd extracted all useful information from the communication. "We've confirmed that he's alive and monitoring American news," she told me during a final update call, "but beyond that the letter hasn't provided leads that bring us closer to locating him. The forensic analysis suggests the paper might be European in origin, but that's such a broad geographic area that it doesn't meaningfully narrow our search parameters. We're going to continue monitoring for any additional communications, but realistically this is probably the only direct contact we'll receive from Brennan. He's smart enough to know that repeated letters would increase the chances of making a mistake that might compromise his location." Her assessment carried a tone of frustration mixed with resignation, the acknowledgement that some fugitive successfully disappeared and remained hidden despite extensive investigative efforts. The second anniversary of discovering the safe arrived with considerably less emotional weight than the first had carried. I'd reached a kind of acceptance about the house and its history, no longer viewing the Victorian as contaminated by Thomas's crimes but instead as a structure that had survived various occupants and would outlast my ownership eventually as well. The renovations were complete except for minor projects that I tackled whenever motivation and budget aligned. The basement remained my favorite space, transformed so thoroughly from its original state that visitors who didn't know the history would never suspect what had been hidden there. Marcus had moved on to other contracting projects but remained a friend who stopped by occasionally for dinner or drinks on the porch. Helen continued her role as neighborhood guardian and historical repository, sharing stories about Maple Ridge Drive that provided context for my experience and reminded me that every house accumulated complicated histories through decades of human occupation. The victim compensation process had largely concluded by the spring of the third year, with final distributions made to investors who'd filed claims and recovery efforts suspended for assets that remained beyond reach. The total recovery rate had exceeded initial estimates, with most victims receiving between 60 and 75% of their original investments. Agent Stern sent a final summary report that detailed the disposition of Thomas's seized assets and acknowledged that my discovery of the safe had been instrumental in achieving recovery rates that were extraordinary for fraud cases where the perpetrator successfully fled. On behalf of the Bureau and the victims whose lives you helped restore, thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation, she wrote in a closing note that felt like official permission to move forward without continued connection to Thomas's crimes. Your discovery provided justice that seemed impossible after Brennan's disappearance, and while I know the process was difficult for you personally, please understand that your actions made a meaningful difference for dozens of families. Patricia Lawson called one final time in early summer to share that she'd retired from teaching and was planning the European vacation she'd postponed for years while working to rebuild her savings. I'm going to Portugal actually, she said with no awareness of the irony given Thomas's letter postmark. Lisbon has been on my list forever, and thanks to the compensation I can finally afford to go. I wanted you to know before I left that I think about you every day and remain grateful for what your renovation project accidentally uncovered. You gave me back the retirement I thought I'd lost, and I'm going to spend every day of it appreciating that gift. Her gratitude was touching and genuine, unmarred by any knowledge of my hesitation about reporting Thomas's letter or my ongoing ambivalence about the costs of discovery. To her, I was simply the person whose honesty had restored her future, and that uncomplicated narrative was probably what I needed to accept rather than complicating it with confessions about moral struggles and delayed decisions. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had become genuinely mine during the 3 years since I'd first seen Victor Kane's listing. Every room reflected my taste and efforts, and the structure itself had been transformed into something beautiful that honored its Victorian character while incorporating modern amenities that made it actually livable. I'd developed routines and rhythms in the space, morning coffee on the front porch while watching light filter through the trees, evening reading in the basement's comfortable silence, weekend projects that maintained and improved the property incrementally. Helen had become the grandmother figure I'd lost years earlier, offering advice and companionship without judgment or expectation. Marcus had evolved into someone whose friendship was valuable precisely because it asked nothing beyond mutual respect and occasional shared meals. The life I'd built in Ashford Grove wasn't the one I'd imagined when I'd fled Portland after my divorce, but it was mine in ways that felt authentic and sustainable. Thomas's letter remained filed in a drawer in my home office, preserved in the plastic bag that Agent Stern had returned after forensic analysis was complete. I took it out occasionally and reread his careful justifications and hollow apologies, trying to understand what motivated someone to steal millions of dollars and abandon their entire life rather than face consequences for their actions. The psychology remained opaque to me despite repeated examinations, suggesting a fundamental difference in how Thomas and I understood concepts like responsibility and obligation. He'd chosen freedom over accountability, comfort over justice, and he'd been willing to sacrifice relationships and identity to protect himself from prosecution. I'd chosen disclosure over self-protection, involvement over avoidance, and while those choices had cost me considerably in terms of privacy and peace, they'd also allowed me to sleep at night without guilt about enabling someone's escape from deserved consequences. The difference between our choices reflected values that probably couldn't be reconciled through any amount of analysis or understanding. The question of whether I'd made the right decisions throughout the investigation remained something I wrestled with during quiet moments when the house felt too empty or the renovation work couldn't distract me from larger questions about purpose and meaning. Had I been obligated to report the safe's contents, or would keeping them hidden have been defensible given my lack of connection to Thomas's crimes? Was my hesitation about reporting his letter a moral failure or simply a reasonable consideration of costs I'd already paid for doing the right thing? Did virtue require constant sacrifice of personal well-being, or was there a point at which self-protection became ethically acceptable even if it meant limiting your involvement in others' justice? These questions had no definitive answers, existing instead in gray areas where reasonable people could disagree based on how they weighted competing values and obligations. Claire would have answered differently than Natalie, who would have answered differently than Marcus, and all of their perspectives were valid even when they contradicted each other. What I knew with certainty was that the house had taught me something important about the relationship between property and history, about how spaces absorbed the actions of their occupants and carried those memories forward into future ownership. The Victorian on Maple Ridge Drive had been home to Thomas's crimes, but it had also been home to families before him and would be home to others after I eventually sold it or passed it along. The safe had been one moment in a much longer timeline, significant but not definitive in determining what the house meant or what it would become. Helen had been right about that during our early conversations about the property's history. Buildings outlasted their occupants' dramas, surviving scandals and tragedies and continuing to provide shelter and beauty long after specific human stories had faded into archived records and fading memories. The house wasn't Thomas's despite his crimes being the most dramatic chapter in its recent past. It was its own entity, a structure with character and presence that transcended any single owner's choices or failures. The phone call came on a morning in late September, nearly 4 years after Marcus and I had torn down that false wall in the basement. I was refinishing the front porch railings when my phone buzzed with an unknown number that displayed a Portuguese country code. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was either a scam call or perhaps another journalist who'd somehow obtained my number. But something made me answer, maybe curiosity or maybe the strange certainty that this call was connected to Thomas Brennan despite the years that had passed since his letter. The voice on the other end was female, middle-aged, with an accent that sounded vaguely American but softened by years of speaking other languages. "My name is Diane Brennan," she said without preamble or greeting. "I know you probably never expected to hear from me, and I apologize for calling without warning. But I need to tell you something about the safe you found and what Thomas left inside it. Something he never explained in his letter because he was too proud to admit the full truth about why we disappeared." Her voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, the weariness of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight for too long and had finally decided to set it down regardless of consequences. I sat down heavily on the porch steps, paint roller forgotten in my hand as I tried to process that I was actually speaking with someone who'd been missing for over 6 years. Agent Stern had told me that Diane was probably still with Thomas, but hearing her voice made the reality of their continued existence feel immediate in ways that abstract knowledge hadn't. "Where are you calling from?" I asked, and immediately regretted the question because obviously she wouldn't reveal her location to someone who'd already reported one communication to federal authorities. Diane's soft laugh acknowledged the absurdity of my question. "I'm somewhere safe," she said simply. "Somewhere Thomas can't find me anymore because I left him 8 months ago after finally accepting that the life we were living wasn't sustainable for me. He doesn't know I'm contacting you, and he'd be furious if he found out. But I think you deserve to understand the complete truth about what you discovered in that basement." Her story unfolded over the next hour as I sat on my porch steps listening to a woman describe a marriage that had deteriorated gradually under the weight of isolation and Thomas's inability to accept genuine accountability for his choices. "They'd been living in Vietnam for the past 3 years, Diane explained, in a coastal city where expatriate communities absorbed newcomers without asking too many questions about their pasts. Thomas had been comfortable enough financially but increasingly paranoid about discovery, monitoring American news obsessively and making them relocate whenever he convinced himself that investigators were getting close. The lifestyle had been suffocating in ways Diane hadn't fully anticipated when she'd agreed to disappear with him. They couldn't form real friendships because maintaining their false identities required constant vigilance about personal details. They couldn't travel freely because border crossings increased the risk of identification. They couldn't even argue openly in their apartment because Thomas feared that neighbors might overhear something that would compromise their cover stories. The breaking point had come during a conversation about the letter Thomas had sent me, Diane revealed. She discovered it by accident while looking through his desk for documents they needed to renew their visas under their assumed names. Reading his words about the safe being his penance and his confession had enraged her because she'd watched him express no genuine remorse for the victims during their years together in hiding. "He wrote to you as if leaving that evidence was some noble gesture," Diane said, her voice sharp with anger that had clearly been building for years. "But the truth is that he only preserved those materials because he was terrified of what would happen if he was ever caught without any leverage for negotiating a reduced sentence. The safe wasn't penance, it was insurance. A way to potentially trade cooperation for leniency if investigators ever tracked us down. He's incapable of actual remorse or genuine accountability. Everything is calculated to serve his interests, including that letter where he pretended to care about the burden his choices placed on you. Diane's account of their years together in hiding painted a portrait of someone who'd made a catastrophic decision during a moment of panic and had spent the subsequent years paying a price she'd never fully calculated. When Thomas had first told her about the investigation closing in and his plan to disappear, she'd been 41 years old with a successful career in marketing and a social life built around friends she'd known for decades. Walking away from that life had seemed impossible until Thomas convinced her that the alternative was watching him go to prison while she faced potential prosecution as an accessory despite having no involvement in his fraud. His promises about their new life together had emphasized freedom and adventure, carefully omitting the reality that permanent flight meant permanent isolation from everything and everyone she'd ever known. "I thought we'd start over somewhere exotic and build a new life that would be different but equally fulfilling," Diane explained. "Instead, we've moved between anonymous apartments in cities where I don't speak the language, using names that feel foreign every time someone addresses me. I haven't spoken to my sister in 6 years. I've missed births and weddings and funerals. I exist but I don't have a life." The decision to leave Thomas had required months of planning executed with the same careful secrecy that had characterized their original disappearance. Diane had slowly accumulated money from the household accounts Thomas managed, small amounts that wouldn't trigger his attention but would eventually provide enough funds to establish herself independently. She'd researched women's shelters and organizations that helped people escape dangerous situations, adapting their advice for her unusual circumstances. When she'd finally left, she'd done so while Thomas was traveling to meet with someone who could provide updated identity documents they needed. She'd taken nothing except cash, a prepaid phone, and clothes that could fit in a single backpack. For the past 8 months she'd been living in a different country under yet another assumed name, supporting herself with remote work that didn't require extensive background verification. The isolation was similar to what she'd experienced with Thomas, but at least now she was alone by choice rather than trapped in a relationship with someone who'd become a stranger she didn't recognize or particularly like. I asked Diane why she was calling me specifically, and her answer revealed that she'd been following the investigation's aftermath as obsessively as Thomas had been. "I read about your testimony at the preliminary hearing," she said. "I saw interviews with some of the victims who talked about how the recovered funds had changed their lives. And I watched you navigate media attention with dignity despite clearly being exhausted by the constant intrusion. You became real to me in a way that Thomas's victims had always remained abstract. He could dismiss them as greedy investors who'd accepted risks, but I couldn't dismiss you as easily because you'd done nothing except buy a house and renovate it honestly. Your involvement was entirely accidental, and yet you chose to report what you found despite knowing it would complicate your life tremendously. That choice bothered me because it highlighted how Thomas and I had both prioritized our own comfort over doing what was right. I've been thinking about calling you for months, trying to decide whether reaching out would help or simply create more problems for someone who's already dealt with enough consequences from Thomas's choices." Her voice broke slightly as she continued explaining her reasons for making contact. "I wanted you to know that not everyone who disappeared was beyond redemption or incapable of recognizing the damage we caused. Thomas will never admit that he was wrong or accept responsibility for destroying people's lives. But I can acknowledge that our choice to run instead of facing consequences was cowardly and selfish. The victims deserved better than having their money stolen by someone who then escaped to live comfortably abroad. You deserved better than becoming entangled in an investigation that wasn't your responsibility. And I deserved better than spending 6 years living a lie with someone who turned out to be exactly as selfish and manipulative as the crimes he committed suggested. I can't undo any of that damage, but I can at least ensure that one person knows the full truth instead of accepting Thomas's sanitized version where he gets to play the complicated anti-hero rather than the straightforward villain." I asked Diane if she'd considered turning herself in and cooperating with authorities who might be willing to show leniency given her limited involvement in Thomas's actual fraud. Her silence stretched long enough that I thought the connection had dropped, but eventually she answered with words that revealed the impossible position she'd created for herself. "I've thought about it constantly," she admitted. "Especially during the past year when living in hiding stopped being an adventure and became simply exhausting. But I'm terrified of what would happen if I came forward. I wasn't directly involved in the Ponzi scheme, but I knew about it for the final 6 months before we disappeared. Thomas told me what he'd been doing and how the investigation was progressing, and I chose to help him plan our exit instead of going to authorities. That probably makes me an accessory after the fact, which could mean prison time even if prosecutors acknowledged my cooperation. And beyond the legal consequences, I'm afraid of the judgment and hatred from victims who'd view me as equally culpable just for being married to Thomas and choosing to disappear with him. Coming forward would mean facing all of that while simultaneously destroying the fragile life I've built over the past 8 months. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do it. We talked for nearly 2 hours that morning, Diane sharing details about her years in hiding that transformed her from an abstract figure in Thomas's story into a complex person who'd made terrible choices for understandable reasons. She described the guilt that had accumulated gradually as she'd watched news coverage of the victim compensation and read testimonials from people whose lives had been destroyed by Thomas's fraud. She explained how leaving Thomas hadn't freed her from complicity but had simply changed the form of her imprisonment from physical confinement with him to psychological confinement with her own conscience. She asked questions about the house and the renovation work I'd completed, seeming genuinely interested in what had become of the property where she'd spent the final months before disappearing. That house was supposed to be our sanctuary, she said at one point. The place where we'd start our married life and build something permanent together. Instead it became a staging ground for crimes and disappearance. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we just stayed there and faced the consequences honestly instead of running. Prison would have been terrible, but at least it would have ended eventually. This exile feels infinite. Before ending the call, Diane asked me not to report our conversation to Agent Stern or anyone else involved in the investigation. I know I don't have any right to ask for your discretion, she said carefully. You've already proven yourself to be someone who does the right thing regardless of personal cost. But I'm asking anyway because reporting this call would force me to disappear again, and I'm so tired of running. I need time to figure out whether I have the courage to turn myself in, and I can't make that decision while being actively pursued. Please give me that time, even though I don't deserve your consideration or protection. Her request placed me in an impossible position that felt grimly familiar. Once again, I was being asked to choose between disclosure that served justice and privacy that protected someone who'd been complicit in crimes even if she hadn't directly perpetrated them. The pattern was exhausting and made me wonder whether my connection to this house would ever fully end or if Thomas's crimes would continue creating ethical dilemmas that complicated my life indefinitely. I didn't promise Diane anything during that initial call, telling her only that I needed time to consider what obligations I had regarding information she'd shared. She accepted my non-commitment with grace and gave me an email address where I could reach her if I decided to report our conversation or if I simply wanted to talk further. The address was obviously temporary and probably routed through anonymizing services, but having any contact information felt significant. After we disconnected, I sat on my porch steps for a long time watching clouds move across the sky and trying to sort through competing feelings about what I'd just learned. Diane's situation evoked sympathy despite my recognition that she'd made choices deserving of consequences. Her willingness to admit fault and express genuine remorse contrasted sharply with Thomas's continued self-justification. But sympathy didn't necessarily translate to obligation to protect her from investigation, and I couldn't ignore that she was still a fugitive regardless of how conflicted she felt about her choices. Marcus came by that evening for dinner we'd planned earlier in the week, and I told him about Diane's call while we prepared food together in my renovated kitchen. His reaction was immediate concern mixed with frustration that Thomas's crimes continued inserting themselves into my life years after the initial discovery. You can't keep getting pulled into this situation, he said firmly while chopping vegetables with more force than necessary. Every time you think you've reached closure, something new happens that requires you to make another impossible decision about disclosure versus privacy. At some point you have to establish boundaries that protect your own well-being rather than constantly sacrificing your peace of mind for other people's justice. Diane made her choices when she helped Thomas disappear, and the consequences of those choices aren't your responsibility to manage or mitigate. But I struggled to accept Marcus's framework that I could simply opt out of involvement by refusing to engage with information I'd received. Diane had trusted me with details about her location and circumstances, and that trust created obligation whether I'd sought it or not. The question wasn't whether I had responsibilities regarding what she'd shared, but rather what those responsibilities actually required from me. Did I owe loyalty to federal investigators who'd involved me in their case through my accidental discovery of the safe? Or did I owe consideration to a woman who'd made terrible mistakes but seemed genuinely remorseful and was actively struggling to determine the right path forward? The competing obligations felt equally valid and completely incompatible, leaving me once again paralyzed by ethical complexity that had no clear resolution. I called Agent Stern 3 days after Diane's initial contact, finally concluding that my obligation to disclosure outweighed any sympathy I felt for someone who remained a fugitive regardless of her complicated circumstances. Agent Stern's excitement was palpable when I explained that Diane had reached out and had revealed she was no longer with Thomas. "This is significant," she said immediately. "If Diane is willing to cooperate and provide information about Thomas's location and activities, we might finally be able to bring him to justice. Even if she doesn't know his current whereabouts, she can provide details about their years together that might help us predict his patterns and identify vulnerabilities in his security practices. The fact that she called you specifically suggests she's considering coming forward but needs reassurance that cooperation will be met with some degree of leniency." Agent Stern asked me to maintain contact with Diane if she reached out again and to encourage her toward voluntary surrender by emphasizing that cooperation would be viewed favorably during prosecution decisions. I agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with being positioned as a recruitment tool for federal investigators but recognizing that encouraging Diane toward accountability was probably the most ethical use of whatever trust she'd placed in me. When Diane called again a week later, I was honest about having reported our first conversation while also expressing my personal belief that facing consequences would ultimately be less burdensome than continuing to live in permanent exile. "The agents I've spoken with have indicated they'd be willing to discuss terms if you came forward voluntarily," I told her carefully. "I can't make promises about what would happen legally, but I genuinely believe that cooperation would be better for you than continuing to run. You sound exhausted and isolated, and those conditions will only intensify the longer you remain in hiding." Diane's response was complicated emotional terrain that revealed the depth of her internal conflict. "Part of me knows you're right," she said slowly. "The rational part that understands I can't live like this indefinitely and that accountability would eventually allow me to rebuild some kind of authentic life. But there's another part that's terrified of imprisonment and public judgment and having to face people whose lives were destroyed partly because of choices I made. Thomas committed the fraud, but I helped him escape consequences and I benefited from stolen money even if I didn't steal it directly. How do I face the victims knowing that I chose protecting myself over helping them get justice?" The question was heartbreaking in its honesty, and I didn't have a good answer beyond platitudes about courage and redemption that felt hollow given the real consequences she'd face if she surrendered. Over the following months, Diane and I developed an unexpected correspondence that existed in the strange space between friendship and something more transactional. She'd call or email every few weeks, sharing details about her isolated life while asking questions about the house and Ashford Grove that suggested she was vicariously experiencing stability through my descriptions of routine and community. I told her about Helen's garden and the seasonal changes on Maple Ridge Drive, about Marcus's latest contracting projects and the small improvements I continued making to the Victorian. She seemed to find comfort in these mundane details, perhaps because they represented the kind of normal life she'd abandoned and might never fully reclaim. During one conversation she asked whether I'd kept any of the furniture they'd left behind, and when I mentioned I'd donated most of it to local charities, she laughed sadly and said that was probably appropriate given that nothing from their previous life deserved preservation. Agent Stern grew increasingly frustrated with Diane's continued hesitation about surrendering, viewing our ongoing communication as evidence that Diane was stringing everyone along without genuine intention to cooperate. "She's using you as an emotional support system while avoiding accountability," Agent Stern said during one of our periodic update calls. "Every week that passes is another week Thomas could be establishing himself more deeply in whatever country he's hiding in, making eventual capture less likely. We need Diane to provide information about his patterns and contacts, but she's refusing to commit to cooperation while simultaneously maintaining connection with you that suggests she wants the emotional benefits of confession without the legal consequences. At some point you need to establish an ultimatum that forces her to make a decision." But I couldn't bring myself to pressure Diane the way Agent Stern wanted, partly because I sympathized with her impossible position and partly because I'd grown to genuinely care about her well-being despite recognizing the crimes she'd been complicit in. Our conversations had revealed a thoughtful person who'd made catastrophic choices during a crisis and had spent years paying a psychological price that wouldn't end regardless of whether she turned herself in. The version of justice that Agent Stern advocated felt important but incomplete, focused on legal accountability while ignoring the human complexity of someone who existed simultaneously as victim and perpetrator. Diane hadn't stolen money from investors, but she'd helped the person who did escape consequences. She'd been manipulated by Thomas's promises, but she'd also made active choices to participate in their disappearance. Holding both truths simultaneously required nuance that the legal system wasn't particularly designed to accommodate. The resolution came in late spring, nearly 8 months after Diane's initial phone call. She contacted me through an email that was longer and more detailed than any previous correspondence, explaining that she'd finally decided to surrender but wanted me to understand her reasoning before she made contact with federal authorities. "I've realized that running doesn't actually protect me from consequences," she wrote. "It just delays them while simultaneously preventing me from ever building anything genuine or meaningful. The past 6 years have been a slow form of death where I've existed physically but haven't really lived. If I'm going to face judgment eventually, and I think that's inevitable given how exhausted I am with hiding, then I'd rather face it now while I still have some energy left to rebuild afterward. I'm not doing this because I've suddenly become brave or noble. I'm doing it because continuing to run has become more unbearable than whatever punishment awaits me." Diane surrendered to American authorities at the embassy in Bangkok 3 weeks later, accompanied by an attorney she'd retained to negotiate terms of her cooperation. The news coverage was extensive but somewhat sympathetic, focusing on her decision to come forward voluntarily and the emotional toll of years spent in hiding with someone whose crimes had destroyed dozens of lives. Agent Stern called to thank me for maintaining contact with Diane and encouraging her toward surrender, though I suspected my actual influence had been minimal compared to Diane's own exhaustion with permanent exile. The information she provided during her initial debriefing sessions apparently included useful details about Thomas's security practices and possible locations he'd mentioned during their time together. Whether that information would lead to his eventual capture remained uncertain, but it at least gave investigators new avenues to explore after years of cold leads. The legal proceedings that followed Diane's surrender were complex and drawn out over many months, but ultimately resulted in a plea agreement that acknowledged her cooperation and limited direct involvement in Thomas's fraud. She received a sentence of 3 years in federal prison, significantly less than the potential decades she might have faced if prosecutors had pursued maximum charges. The victims' reactions to her sentencing were mixed, with some viewing the punishment as too lenient and others acknowledging that her voluntary surrender and cooperation deserved some consideration. Patricia Lawson called me after the sentencing hearing to share that she'd attended and had mixed feelings about seeing Diane in person for the first time. "She looked so small and defeated," Patricia said quietly. "Part of me wanted to hate her for helping Thomas escape, but mostly I just felt sad that so many lives were destroyed by one person's greed and the choices of people who loved him. 3 years in prison won't undo the damage, but at least it's something. At least she chose to face consequences eventually rather than hiding forever like Thomas." I visited Diane once at the federal facility where she was serving her sentence, making the long drive more out of curiosity than any clear sense of obligation. She looked older than I'd expected based on our phone conversations, with gray threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that suggested the psychological toll of her years in hiding. We sat across from each other in a visiting room that was depressing in its institutional sterility, and she thanked me for maintaining contact during her months of indecision about surrendering. "You were the only person during those years who treated me like a human being rather than just a criminal or a victim," she said simply. "Everyone else saw me through the lens of Thomas's crimes, which was fair but didn't leave room for the complexity of actually being a person who'd made terrible mistakes. Your willingness to keep talking to me even after reporting our conversations to the FBI meant more than you probably realized." It reminded me that accountability didn't have to mean complete dehumanization. We talked for an hour about her adjustment to prison life and her plans for after her release. She'd enrolled in educational programs offered through the facility and was working toward a degree in social work, hoping that eventually she might be able to help other people avoid the kind of catastrophic decisions she'd made. "The irony of someone with my history trying to counsel others isn't lost on me," she acknowledged with a wry smile. "But I think my mistakes might actually be useful if I can find ways to talk honestly about how someone makes choices that destroy their life one decision at a time." I never woke up one morning and decided to become a criminal. It was gradual, a series of small compromises that accumulated until I was complicit in something I'd never imagined being part of. If I can help one person recognize that pattern before they're too deep to turn back, maybe my experience will have served some purpose beyond just being a cautionary tale. Thomas was never located despite Diane's cooperation and the renewed investigative efforts that followed her surrender. Agent Stern's final update suggested he'd probably moved to a different country after Diane left him, possibly anticipating that she might eventually cooperate with authorities and wanting to eliminate any advantage her knowledge of his patterns might provide to investigators. The case remained technically open but had been downgraded to inactive status, monitored for any indicators that Thomas had surfaced somewhere but no longer consuming significant resources. He's probably living under a new identity in a country that won't cooperate with extradition requests, Agent Stern explained during what she indicated would be our final official conversation. Without current intelligence about his location or activities, we can't justify continued active investigation. The victims have received substantial compensation, Diane has faced consequences for her role, and Thomas is living in permanent exile, which is its own form of punishment even if it's not the justice we wanted. Sometimes that's the best resolution available in cases like this. The house on Maple Ridge Drive remained my home as years continued passing, accumulating new memories that gradually overshadowed the drama of Thomas's safe and everything that had followed its discovery. I'd lived there long enough now that new neighbors knew me simply as Vanessa who'd renovated the old Victorian rather than the woman who'd found evidence in a fraud case. Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep during my 6th year in the house, and I attended her funeral where I learned she'd left me a substantial portion of her garden plants with instructions that I should tend them as she had and pass them along to the next caretaker of Maple Ridge Drive when my time came. Marcus and I grew closer over those years, our friendship evolving into something deeper that neither of us rushed to define or formalize but that felt solid and sustaining in ways my marriage to Kevin never had. I thought about Thomas occasionally, wondering whether he'd found any genuine happiness in his exile or if the isolation and constant vigilance had made his freedom feel more like an elaborate prison. Diane had suggested during one of our final conversations before her surrender that Thomas was incapable of real satisfaction because his entire identity was built around conquest and manipulation rather than authentic connection. "He'll never be happy anywhere," she'd said with certainty. Because happiness requires being known and accepted, and he can never allow himself to be truly known without risking exposure. His punishment isn't imprisonment, it's living forever behind a mask with people who'll never see or understand who he actually is. Her assessment was probably accurate and suggested a kind of justice that existed outside formal legal structures, the natural consequences of choices that prioritized freedom over authenticity. The safe's cavity in the basement remained visible beneath the finished walls, a small rectangular shadow that marked where something significant had been hidden and then revealed. I'd left it unpatched deliberately, wanting some physical reminder of what the house had contained and what I'd chosen to do with that discovery. Visitors who didn't know the history would never notice the slight irregularity, but I saw it every time I spent time in my favorite room and remembered the moment Marcus and I had broken through the false wall. That memory had lost its sharp edges over the years, becoming simply one part of a larger story about renovation and unexpected discovery and the complicated ethics of knowing things you'd never sought to learn. The house itself had become what Helen had always insisted it was, a structure with its own identity that transcended any single owner's story. Thomas's crimes were part of its history but not its defining characteristic, absorbed into a longer timeline that included births and deaths and ordinary life lived by people who'd occupied these rooms across more than a century. I'd added my own chapter through years of careful restoration and daily living, and eventually someone else would write the next chapter when I sold the property or passed it along. The Victorian would outlast all of us, surviving our dramas and preserving our improvements while remaining fundamentally itself beneath whatever modifications each generation added. That continuity was comforting in ways I'd needed after the chaos of discovery and investigation, reminding me that some things endured regardless of human complications and that home could exist even in structures that held difficult histories. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.